Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, Distinguished Law Professor at Rutgers Law School and Director of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. You can learn more about the center by visiting our website at csrr.rutgers.edu or following us on Instagram at RutgersCSRR or on Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok at RUCSRR. The Race and Rights Podcast explores the myriad issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, here as well as abroad. Today's podcast is entitled The Racial Muslim. In this episode, I'm in conversation with former NPR journalist and Princeton University visiting professor Deborah Amos about my book, The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. We discuss how religious bigotry in the U.S. racializes Muslims and Arabs in ways that mirror the experiences of Jews and Catholics in the early 20th century. Professor Amos and I also examine how xenophobia, Orientalism, and religion intersect to normalize Islamophobia and anti-Arab bias in American society. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you about my labor of love.
So I read your labor of love, and I was very happy to do so. I learned a lot. It's not that I don't know about this. Of course I do. I cover the Middle East, and I cover refugees here, so I know. But you added so many facts to the bones of this story that in some ways I was like, oh my God, I didn't know about that. But you are a target of some of this. And so I guess my first question is going to be, why did you write it? Glad you did, but why?
Well, this is an example of the personal being political and the political being personal. I was a first-year law student in my second week of law school when September 11th happened. I had entered law school with the objective, here's the irony, of going to work on civil rights, human rights, and democracy in the Middle East, specifically in Egypt, which is where I was born, and where my parents immigrated from and left everything behind. And I was convinced that I wanted to be part of the reverse brain drain. And then 9/11 happened. And it was instantaneous. We went from being this either fully invisible or quasi-invisible or racially ambiguous group of people, depending on the context where in the country you were, urban, rural, north, south, east, but generally not really on the racial politics map of the United States, to being the most racialized, hyper-racialized group in the media. Everyone was deluged with media portrayals of Arab-looking men, Muslim-looking men, which was often converged or confused as terrorists, as threats to national security, as suspicious, as unwelcome. And it completely transformed my personal life. It transformed my community. I was raised in the Dallas Muslim community, which is a growing and thriving Muslim community, and also across the country. And another really important fact is that at that point in time, 2001, there were very few lawyers who were Muslim or Arab. The need for the community to have lawyers who understood the community, who had language ability, who could be trusted, was minuscule. The need was very high, but the supply of lawyers was minuscule. So here I am, a 1L law student who doesn't know anything about the law, put out into the front lines, having to deal with all sorts of grievances of people being assaulted, being threatened, being harassed, bullied at school. And I found myself an intern at the ACLU of Texas working on a new project called Post 9/11 Discrimination. And it became a permanent project. And the ACLU continues, as well as other organizations, continue to focus on addressing discrimination against Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. So over the next 20 years, or I should say at least the next 15 years, which is about when I started working on the project in 2016, the book project, I was interning, I was litigating, I was engaging in pro bono policy advocacy, I worked for the government, and there was no shortage of work. And it's taken 20 years for us to finally, as a community, or communities, to have a critical mass of lawyers from the community who self-identify as Muslim or Arab and who want to do civil rights and social justice work that it's, at least we have what I call a defense. In civil society, we have Muslim advocates, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, grew significantly. The Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, which pre-existed in 2001 but has expanded. There were many, the Center for Constitutional Rights, but in 2001, it was very hostile and very lonely. And those who dared to defend Muslim civil rights were called terrorist lawyers. Whether it was David Cole, who I'm indebted to because he was one of the first attorneys, whether it was various lawyers within the ACLU, and nobody wanted to touch us. We literally were radioactive. Just defending us was a basis for being charged with sympathizing with terrorism. And nobody knew that, nobody cared about the differences, right, between a Muslim who was a citizen, a non-citizen, who was from Pakistan, who was from Iran, who was from Egypt. We were all just bundled into one terrorist threat, and it affected every component of our life in a very adverse way.
When I first saw the book, my brain played a trick on me. I read The Radical Muslim because you see it all the time. And it took me a while to go, oh, that's not what that is. This is something different. And I gave it a close read in the past week, and I started to think, I got immediately what you were talking about. But if you landed in the Middle East and you started talking to people in the Middle East about racial Muslims, would they know what you're talking about? Would you have to explain to them? And if you did, how would you explain it to them?
So race is a very American and Western construct that is intertwined intensely with the transatlantic slave trade, with European colonialism, with settler colonialism, especially in the United States. It's a social construct. And I am one of those infamous, notorious critical race theorists who teaches in law schools, not in K through 12 schools, which is where people are misdirecting their opposition to critical race theory.
I hope that you're defiantly going to Florida on occasion.
Yes, my defiance extends beyond that, but yes. So this social construct is very American-focused and European-focused, although I think in Europe it tends to articulate itself more along immigrant status, ethnicity, national origin for various reasons. But this book is very much focused on the United States and very much focused on the experiences of Muslims who have immigrated or from Muslim-majority countries, primarily the Middle East and North Africa, or were mistaken as such, their children and their grandchildren. So in the Middle East or in Muslim-majority countries, they absolutely understand the concept, which is mainly couched in Orientalism and clash of civilizations narratives, because that's the paradigm under which they've suffered as formerly colonized countries. In other words, they understand that there is bias against Muslims, that there is hatred for Islam or suspicion of Islam or presumptions that Islam teaches violence, presumptions that Muslims support politically motivated violence as a matter of faith, which of course is false. They understand that the West and people who live in the West are frequently mistaking extreme fringe violent groups who we can call terrorists, we can call militias, we can call insurgents. They're engaging in politically motivated violence for various purposes. And they do it under the guise of Islam. But if you ask most Muslims across the world, they'll tell you this is a very specific geopolitical conflict that tends to be often part of a civil war, part of a foreign occupation, or a response to political repression by their own government. They do not in any way think, oh yeah, they all represent us. Al-Qaeda represents us. Osama bin Laden represents us. Right? Hezbollah represents us. Hamas represents us. And I'm naming groups that the U.S. has designated as terrorists. They couch it in the same context as the Ku Klux Klan in America, as the Proud Boys, as the Oath Keepers. I mean, how laughable is it to go to other countries and say, yes, if you want to understand all white Americans, you should understand the Ku Klux Klan because they all want to be in the Ku Klux Klan. They all sympathize with the Ku Klux Klan. And they either tell you truthfully or they lie about it. That's outrageous and offensive. That doesn't mean the Ku Klux Klan doesn't exist, but we understand the context in which it exists. And so I think in the Middle East, they're certainly sensitive to, and they're aware of it. Actually, another consequence of post 9/11 discrimination and bias was, especially in the first 10 years, it's abetted since then, is Arabs were not sending their children to the United States to study. You saw a decrease in the number of international students from the Persian Gulf and from other Muslim majority countries, from families who obviously could afford it. And they were sending them to London, or they were sending them to Germany, or they were sending them to maybe Turkey, because they were hearing about all of these stories of mosques getting vandalized, of women wearing hijab getting attacked in the street, of Sikhs who were mistaken for Muslim, who were being murdered in addition to being physically assaulted. And they were scared for their children. So we actually did see a decrease in international students, and that I think is and also anecdotally, when I would go back to visit, they would say, oh yeah, we're going to Europe, we're not going to America, for those who could afford to travel. The presumption was we're going to go in America and they're going to attack us physically, which of course wasn't true in terms of as a general matter, but they understood that there was a deep resentment and hatred and suspicion of Islam and Muslims.
One of the things that was interesting to read, I mean, certainly I was a reporter after 9/11, and we felt exactly what you're talking about. You know, we actually got into some places where there was a Muslim in every jail cell because the roundup was so unbelievably intense. What surprised me is to see that police training still has elements of this Islamophobia where, you know, you got to watch out for the religious ones. Those are the ones that will turn. And they are taught this. And so it perpetuates this notion that if you're religious, they're going to look at you a little closer than they would look at like somebody like you, who you've got no headscarf on. You probably wouldn't wear that in Egypt, would be my guess, on the streets. But here, you know, this signifies that you are a secular Muslim. And so could you talk a little bit about this notion that this training is still using these old definitions?
Yeah. So whenever you examine how racialization impacts what we call subordinated communities, as a term of art in critical race theory, it's not just it's the intergroup interaction, usually between the majority and minority or the powerful and less powerful group, but it's also the intra-community responses that can be at a collective level or at an individual level. So how do people respond to oppression, discrimination, bias, hatred? And there's a wealth of social psychology literature that talk about these strategies. It tends to fall into what we call the identity performance literature. How do you perform your identity to avoid discrimination? And that can be from how you speak, to how you dress, to obviously how you behave, who you associate with, who you're willing to marry, who you're willing to befriend and seen in public with. And all of that is an attempt to, in part at least, avoid the adverse impact of being a subordinated group or associated with that. So when you think of kind of the most extreme example in African American communities in the past, during Jim Crow, and is passing, and trying to pass as white. So that literature informs how I examine the responses of Muslims, which is an extremely diverse community, extreme diverse population. Just a quick breakdown. 70% are immigrants or children of immigrants. You're talking about a population of approximately 4 to 7 million. It's hard to know exactly how many because of the census. It's not a lot, although they got so much attention in the media. It was remarkable, as if it was, and there were even these anti-Sharia campaigns, these allegations that Muslims were going to invade and take over. 30% African American, and 30% Arab American or from Middle East, North Africa, 30% from South Asia, 5% Latino, which is the fastest growing number of converts, and another 5% that are multiracial or of European origin. they were all being discriminated against in different ways, right? And depending on, the state doesn't have all the resources to go after everyone, even if it's only 1% to 2%. So they also have to be strategic in who they're going to target. So this is where I call, like, the racial Muslim is a topology. It's a hierarchy. You have the religious dissident Muslim, which is the most likely to be targeted by the state in terms of immigration enforcement and deportation, in terms of surveillance, counterterrorism prosecution, and so forth. That person is highly religious, and so they usually maybe wear a headscarf if they're a woman. They pray 5 times a day, meaning they ask for religious accommodation at work. They fast. It's easy to determine that this person is devout. And they're a dissident, which means they oppose the Iran war. They oppose the collective punishment of Muslims as a result of 9/11. Right? They oppose U.S. foreign policy in Israel, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia. They might not support the fact that we support dictators in the Middle East. They might not support the sanctions against Iran. They might find it to be completely counterproductive and punitive against innocent Iranian civilians, and so on and so forth. So it's dissent against foreign policy in Muslim majority countries, because that then means you're not loyal, you're not patriotic. Because when you're a subordinated group, you don't have the fullest extent of your rights. So you may be able to dissent, and Deborah Amos is a thoughtful, critical thinker who is engaged politically and civically. We might not like her ideas, but it's a very American thing that she's doing. If Sahar Aziz does it, especially if Sahar Aziz is wearing a headscarf and devoutly practicing, suddenly, I don't deserve to be here. I need to go home. Go back to where you came from because you don't belong here. And so those are the most targeted. The second level is religious, but apolitical or mainstream political. And they're still suspicious because the fact that they're devout means we don't know if they're sympathizing with terrorists. We don't know if they'll be easily recruited by terrorists, because the link, the nexus of terrorism is their faith. That's the stereotype. The very fact that you're a devout and you believe in Islam means that you may be theologically committed to politically motivated violence against the United States. The third is the secular dissident. So someone who may be Muslim by name, but doesn't really practice, doesn't have ties to the mosque or to practicing Muslims, for practical purposes, fully, quote unquote, assimilated into white Protestant normativity, but is a political dissident on U.S. foreign policy. You tend to see they tend to often be those who are critical of U.S. foreign policy on Palestine. And they might be secular, they might even be Arab Christians, Palestinian Christians, sure. Because being Arab, you're presumed to be Muslim, which we know is false. It's a critical mass of Christian minorities and Jews who have lived there for centuries and never left, right, to go to Europe or other places. And then you have the ideal model Muslim, which is the secular Muslim. Apolitical, mainstream politics, fully secularized. You're the immigrant we want. And that doesn't apply just to Muslims. Right? We see this in various other immigrant communities. But that's the topology, and that's how you respond to people that say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. There is no Islamophobia. I haven't experienced it. So you have to ask some more questions about, well, what kind of lifestyle do you have? Who do you associate with? How religious are you? Do you express that religiosity? Do people know about it? Right? And so on and so forth. And so that helps to explain both the response of the communities and how the state targets the communities. And just as a fact, there were studies that were done right after 9/11 that showed that young Muslim women were taking off their headscarves. And that was to protect themselves, to the extent that their mothers were telling them that, their fathers were telling them that. And these were religious families who, as far as they were concerned, they believed it was mandatory. There's a big debate, yes, as you know, among Muslims as to whether the headscarf is mandatory or encouraged. But that was the extent of their fear.
So right after 9/11, there were tons of reports. If you came to the airport and the people at the desk were able to question you, you didn't go up the line, it was them. The lowest common denominator in border security. And if you had alarms on your phone that went off 5 times a day, that you would get busted at the airport. Any sign of being a Muslim. And you write a lot about how this racializing of Muslims has actually denied Muslims the full benefits of freedom of religion in this country. And I wonder if you can talk about that. You know, some of it died down after 9/11, but clearly in your book, but not all, that it still happens.
There are different phases of post 9/11 discrimination, at least since over the last 20 years. The first phase was the severe backlash right after, for the first 2 or 3 years. And many of the Muslims responded with duck and hide. Quiet, don't push back, this shall pass. This sense of extreme vulnerability. And that tended, and many of the Muslims who were in leadership positions were immigrants, as opposed to people born here or at least raised here, even if born abroad. And therefore, you don't have the same level of language conversancy, you don't have people in journalism, in politics, in law, because that type of collective human capital is essential for collective self-defense. And so a lot of people don't realize, because 70% of the community is immigrant or non-immigrant, now we're talking about second-generation Americans, they all came after 1965, right? 1924 law, it sets very strict quotas on who can immigrate, and it was a explicitly anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic law intended to stop the millions of Italian Catholics and Irish Catholics and Eastern European Jews who had come for the last 40 years, almost 40 million had immigrated. They were transforming the population in most of the major cities, and it was creating white nativist hysteria, white Protestant, Northwest European white Protestant hysteria. The Ku Klux Klan resurged, its membership exponentially increased, and it culminated in the 1924 national origin laws. And many people don't know that 1924 law is why the United States couldn't take Jewish immigrants and Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. And Congress refused to amend the law. So it wasn't the Arabs and the Muslims who engaged in the Holocaust. It wasn't the Arabs and the Muslims who kept the Jews from immigrating here to the United States or seeking refuge. This is a European problem. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because oftentimes Arabs and Muslims are presumptively anti-Semitic. They're presumed to hate Jews. And that's just absolutely false if you look at the history of the Middle East and compare it to the history of Europe. So in 1965, so it takes 50 years of this whitening or Northwest Europeanizing, Protestantizing of the population. And then in 65, you get the removal of those national origin quotas. You also, a few years earlier, remove the Asian exclusion laws, which were intended to keep out the Chinese and the Japanese and people from Far East Asia. And that's when then people from the Middle East could actually immigrate in significant numbers. So I say that to say that immigrant Muslims and their children and grandchildren are very new to this country. And most of them came as doctors and as engineers and as business owners. They weren't lawyers, they weren't journalists, and they weren't politicians, right? So phase one was an extreme phase of vulnerability. Phase two was when my generation said, okay, we may not have a lot of experience, but we have to fight like hell because this is an existential crisis. We are afraid of ending up in jail. I'll give you an anecdote, which I don't talk about, not an anecdote, a personal experience, which I don't talk about in the book, maybe in the next book. When I was a third-year law student, I hosted a conference called Islam and the Law, the Question of Sexism. The reason I hosted it is because I was sick and tired of hearing my professors at the University of Texas and their guests, who were other professors, engage in just unashamed Islamophobia. They were saying that the Arabs are irrational, that the Arabs just hate America, that Muslims hate America. Not everyone, but enough that it really affected me, and I decided I'm going to have my own conference. Because, of course, all the speakers at the conferences, none of them were from the Middle East. None of them had an expertise in the Middle East. None of them had language skills. None of them had actually gone and lived in Muslim-majority countries. Yet they were talking to us as if we were these subjects, about us. And I invited all of these professors who were either of Middle East origin or experts, but people who really knew what they were talking about. And some of them had identities where they had been raised there. And as a result of that conference, the Army intelligence in Fort Hood, Texas, opened an investigation.
Of you?
Of the conference. But I was the organizer. And they asked for the roster and they asked for the videotape because somebody had made a complaint that there were suspicious Middle East characters. I was like, did you mean all Middle Easterners are suspicious? And the complainants were Army intelligence personnel that had been sent to the conference. That was the world we were living in 2003. That was my world. And this was a conference at a university. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a sit-in. It wasn't a boycott, God forbid. So that's when we realized that it's time to defend American democracy. This country, I don't need to go to Egypt. I don't need to go to the Middle East. This is happening right here in the United States. And if you weren't experiencing that, you wouldn't believe it. So for the next 10 years, we were fighting and nobody believed us. They didn't think that the problem was that serious. There was all this, it's an anomaly, it's an exception. Oh, well, maybe you did something. Maybe you look the wrong way. Maybe it's a lot of victim blaming. Well, maybe there are terrorists in that mosque and it should be surveilled. Or the person who vandalized it, well, they're just crazy. And then the worst and best thing happened at the same time. And that was the election of Donald Trump.
That was the worst and the best?
Well, it was the worst thing for this country, if I may be partisan, for reasons that I think we all know, if you want to, at least for purposes of polarization and division and the rise of white supremacy and xenophobia and all sorts of bigotry. But it was the best thing that ever happened, unfortunately, for combating Islamophobia because it laid it naked.
Yeah.
For finally, what we had been studying, what we had been trying to, the media didn't want to pick those stories up. We didn't have the platforms to educate the public to say, there is a serious problem here. Religious freedom is under threat. Bigotry is becoming normalized and mainstreamed. Children are harmed. Women's rights are being compromised because the only time Americans seem to care about women's rights is if the perpetrator is Arab or Muslim, but they don't care if it's an American that's not Arab or Muslim. Oh, that doesn't affect women's rights. So that's when you saw the airport protests, right, with the Muslim ban.
They were amazing.
That was the wake-up call. But Trump didn't just come out of nowhere. I mean, he was a culmination. He was just the mirror. He was the pinnacle of something that had been going on for years. And that was, I think, the point when more and more people who weren't necessarily personally affected by Islamophobia realized that the blatant entrenchment and the normalization of it was a threat to American values. I mean, it's not the only form of racism, it's not the only form of bias, and we know that Trump normalized and mainstreamed all forms of bias and some violence. But on that particular issue, it was very hard to get people to understand that it was systemic and that it was deeply entrenched. And so that, I think, helped to accelerate and embolden the young people too. So something else has happened in the last 5 years where you have two things: the coming of age of now the second generation Americans whose parents were raised or born in this country. And they're going to school and they're being told in American schools that we believe in free speech, we believe in religious freedom, we believe in racial equality, we have the best constitution in the world, we have the best democracy in the world. We're so democratic that we go to the Middle East and try to teach them democracy. Except when the person who wins the fair and free election isn't who we want to win, and then suddenly we're not so committed to democracy outside the country. But the point is, that generation is saying, okay, so here's what I'm learning and here's what I'm living. And I'm seeing my mother and I'm seeing my aunts and I'm seeing my mosque, and I'm experiencing myself that the more people perceive me as religious and critical as a critical thinker that doesn't just go along to get along, it doesn't try to assimilate blindly into the majority identity, which is absolutely informed for historical reasons by Northwest European cultural norms and Protestant identity and cultural norms. Well, now it's become more Judeo-Christian, it's expanded the national identity. the less friendly people are to me, the more hostile they become, the more I suddenly find myself not a member of the in-group, but a member of an out-group. And so they realized that we have a lot more in common with people of color who have historically been, and whose oppression has been documented much more than Muslim and Arab communities have. So this book is effectively one contribution among many to document that reality in hopes that it at least stops to a de minimis level and doesn't repeat itself.
That's a new word that I've learned from the Supreme Court. One of the things that you talk about, and it's a little shocking when you realize part of the reason that Muslims don't have full freedom of religion is because there are people, and some of them are in the judiciary, who say it's not a religion, that it's a political movement. And so you get rulings that are, of course, no one can say that officially, but they behave as if it is true. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that is possible in a country that prides itself on religious freedom that can do this to one particular creed.
So that goes to the fundamental research question that animated my academic approach to the book, which is this paradox. How does a country that privileges religious freedom in its laws and in its norms engage in or produce such overt and mainstream discrimination, bias, bigotry against a religious minority, in this case, Muslims? It's one thing to ask that question in France, which is a very different political, historical, legal backdrop, than to ask it in the United States. And I had really hoped I would find the book that would explain that, because it just kept going on in my mind, going, how is this happening? And then the fact that really kind of brought it home were these polls, facts, multiple polls that kept showing that the people who held the highest levels of anti-Muslim bias, when asked questions like, would you want a Muslim to be your neighbor? Would you want your child to marry a Muslim? Do you think a Muslim can be president? Do you think that Muslims can be elected? Can we trust them to serve in Congress? Things of that nature, they would say no. Right? Do you think that Islam teaches violence or supports violence? Yes. The individuals who were most likely to answer in ways that were Islamophobic were people who were Trump supporters and Christian evangelicals. Not all Christian evangelicals, but the numbers were significantly higher than if you compared them to Democratic voters or if you compared them to people who didn't self-identify as evangelical Christian. So that just brings the paradox, it just makes it even more glaring, because the evangelical Christian groups tend to also be the same groups who are alleging that their religious freedom rights are being violated when they have to bake a cake
for a gay person.
When they have to give a morning after pill, abortion, or contraception even, as a pharmacist to someone because they don't believe in that in their religion. And they tend to be, and it's pretty clear, they're proud of it, supporting the prohibition of abortion for everyone. Not all of Christian evangelical groups. But the point is, some of the most religious Christians who themselves declare or bemoan the infringement on their religious freedom rights support infringing the religious freedom rights, or at least support racist behavior against Muslims. And I kept saying, how do they reconcile that? Because either they're thinking, yeah, what we really mean is religious freedom for Christians. This is a Christian country. And if you're not Christian, or if you're not a religion that we've accepted, right? So if you think, some people would say we're Judeo-Christian, so we'll include Jews, but not Muslims, not Hindus, not Zoroastrians, not Buddhists. So either that, and they just don't think the First Amendment applies to everyone, or they've somehow convinced themselves of the fallacy that Islam isn't a religion. It's not legitimate. It doesn't count as a religion that's protected. And the reason is that it's a political ideology. It's a violent political ideology. So it's a fascinating kind of perverse twist on the argument that Al-Qaeda is a political organization. Hamas is a political organization. And that's true. They may use Islam as their legitimation ideology, which doesn't mean that all Muslims agree with them. But they're ultimately a product of geopolitical realities, right? So they've taken that, which is actually an anti-Islamophobia argument to say don't stereotype all Muslims, and saying, yeah, all Muslims are Islam's a political ideology. And therefore, all these people, they're not really a religious group, and therefore, none of these laws and norms apply to them. And effectively, they're a race.
So, you ask Europeans deep down, and they will talk about the gates of Vienna. That was a real fight. And, okay, there's Islamophobia in Europe, but it's different. And I wondered if some of this, and that you have really sort of tapped into the bedrock of what it's about, the racial Muslim is about eugenics, because we didn't have anybody at the gates of Vienna. We didn't. And that fight never happened in America. But yet, there is still uncomfortable fit. And I wondered if it gets caught up in how you got tagged at the turn of the last century in this insane 25 years. And it ends up being the undercurrent of the 24 laws, because everybody's a eugenicist, including a president. Woodrow Wilson was a eugenicist. And I wondered if you thought that that's the American version of the gates of Vienna.
Well, my kind of theoretical framework is that there are 4 factors that are producing the social construct of the racial Muslim, right? The racialization of Muslims. The first is white dominance or white supremacy, however you want to label it. But the dominance of particularly Northwest European, but I think it's expanded to European identity. Xenophobia, which is another paradox of this country that wants immigrants, needs immigrants, and hates immigrants, and wants to deport immigrants at the same time. So xenophobia is a significant part of American society historically and contemporarily. It's just different groups get switched out. Orientalism, European Orientalism that was transported and transplanted to the United States. And then 4th, American empire building in Muslim-majority countries, which started in earnest after World War II. And I think those 4 factors kind of converge, and the interplay between them is what explains this racialization process, particularly post 9/11, although I talk about the pre-9/11 period leading up to it. And so this 3rd factor, Orientalism, this country intellectually is a derivative of European society, particularly Northwest European society, whether you talk about philosophy, history, politics. You just need to go and see what students learn. They learn about Europe, and they spend years learning about Europe, and maybe a little bit about Africa, and a little bit about Asia, and a little bit about the Middle East, and that's their world history, right? So we can't underestimate the influences of the Western experience historically. And although Americans are not, Orientalism isn't front and center, it's embedded and it's entrenched. And I think that's where you saw the rise of the clash of civilization within the public discourse starting in the 1990s, because once we lost the Soviet Union as our enemy, we needed another foreign enemy. We need another external enemy. And this is also part of America's history and a part of many other nations' history. It's a way to mobilize the population, to avoid internal fracturing, and so on. But there's been articles written about the Green Menace, that now it was Islam and not the Soviet Union, and 9/11 really kind of sealed that. But whether you're talking about Samuel Huntington, Bernard Lewis, who is European, it's not a surprise that the clash of civilizations was accepted so wholeheartedly by the intellectual elite. And I think that certainly stems from the relationship of Europe to the Middle East, which I think is actually much more connected to real geopolitical conflict. I mean, the Ottoman Empire was a serious political contender and competitor. And they did, in fact, occupy and conquer parts of Eastern Europe and Bosnia, Albania, Macedonia. I mean, there's a reason. That's why we have so many Muslims within that part of the world.
They just borrowed too much money.
Right. Ultimately went bankrupt. So that at least is grounded in a real political dispute, whereas in the US, it's manufactured in many ways. Because as you said, the Middle East, North Africa, Muslim majority countries have threatened as nations, as governments, as people, have not posed any threat to the United States. And these political groups, if you really want to be skeptical and a critic, much of them, they have been bolstered. They have been strengthened by American foreign policy in those regions. Mm-hmm. We all know where the Mujahideen originated from and where Osama bin Laden learned how to fight in Afghanistan. We also know that it was the United States that provided them the military and financial support and the political cover in the Cold War. And we can talk about Hamas, we can talk about Hezbollah, but you have to also talk about the situation of Palestine, of Gaza being an open-air prison. You have to talk about Lebanon and its relationship with Israel in the Civil War. These groups operate in a political environment. What we lack, I think, in this country, because racism causes us to be intellectually lazy, racism causes us not to learn and seek nuance, because it allows us to just categorically dismiss people we disagree with or categorically dismiss their grievances and justify us occupying, as opposed to really thinking about things deeply and realizing that simply by removing Saddam Hussein, who was the most brutal dictator in the region, wasn't going to suddenly create this utopian state, but in fact led to the murder and deaths of millions of Iraqis, to the extent that some Iraqis have said, at least we had physical safety and security. So the point is, if you just say, well, they're all terrorists, he's an evil guy, let's just take him down, that's such a simplistic way of looking at it. And I think part of it is that when we stereotype, when we homogenize, when we engage in racist thinking, even in xenophobic thinking, even if we don't consciously do it, we actually hurt our foreign policy. We hurt our own interests, and we end up spending billions of dollars and causing the deaths of millions of civilians, and also causing the death of our own service people in the military.
Correct. So this week was an interesting week. This week we had a green building for Eid in New York City. And I don't know if that's happened before. It probably has, and I just hadn't noticed it. But I did notice it this time. And there was an iftar at the White House. I don't think there was in the Trump years. I'd be surprised if there was. I don't think so.
There are always some good secular Muslims that you can invite.
And so there's this concept that you talk about that I just really like. It's the racial bribe. And it's what other groups have done to become airfinger white. And, Muslims have to decide if they want to do it. Muslims have to decide if they can do it, because it has to do also with how you look. Can you pass? And so we're not there yet. You bring it up, you say it's what the others have done, and it kind of is the price that you pay. And I wondered if you thought that, A, Muslims will do it, if Muslims can do it, or there's another way as time goes on.
Muslims have, in significant numbers, started to attain that social capital, politically, economically, socially. So the Green Building may be a result of more Muslims voting. I mean, New York City also has a very large Muslim population.
That matters.
Now citizens.
Yeah, that matters.
Running for office, although those who run for office are often virulently attacked. That's my current research. And they are still not represented well in some spaces. And they're becoming lawyers and being able to defend themselves. But the question is it on condition that you act a certain way, dress a certain way, associate with certain people? That's not, I think, unique to Muslims. I think the question, the racial justice question, the social justice question is, how much do we allow members of subordinated communities the individual choice to be their authentic self as compared to members of the majority group? And I think that's really the true test of equality.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race, and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.